Welcome, everybody. My name is Mina Jane. I'm the director of the Ashland Public Library in Massachusetts, which is in the US. I like to point that out because Alexis is coming to us from across the pond in England, I believe, right?
Yes, that's right.
That's right, because you went to King's College. We were just talking about that. And we actually have people here from the UK, so
Yes.
all over the place. I'm going to introduce Alexis in just a minute, but I just wanted to say a couple things first. One is I'd like to thank the Friends of the Ashland Public Library for supporting all of our program. We couldn't do this fun stuff without them. And I'd like to thank Alexis for letting us share this program with other libraries. I was just telling her, I think like 22 are partnering with us, and we're so excited because when libraries come together and work together. We kind of make magic, not in an evil, witchy way, but just in a wonderful library way. So, if Alexis does have slides, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A. I will moderate them after her slides are finished. I will be turning the Q&A, the chat off during her slides so that we're not distracted. We can totally focus on witches. Um, you can buy sign. I think you're going to have to contact Alexis directly on social media in order to get signed books, but you can, of course, buy her books anywhere, and you can certainly find them at your local libraries. So, without further ado, I'd love to introduce you to Alexis Prescott, who's just fascinating. She's going to be talking about her book, The First Witches. If you've been with us before, you know that we've done programs around witches with the Salem Witch Museums, and we're endlessly interested. But what I love about this is Alexis, who is a historian and into classical literature and teaches at, is it King's College? Do you teach that?
No, I teach in schools now, so I that's what I mainly do. Yeah, school
Oh,
teacher.
okay. She is a teacher, but is a lover of classics. And so she has combined her interest of classics and history and witches to come up with this book, First Witches, about how witches first started coming up in literature back in the Roman Greco times and how that has affected our perception of witches even today. So, Alexis, welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, and thank you so much for asking me to talk about witches today, and also my book. I actually have the physical copy of it here. It's been available in the UK for a couple of months now, and in the US it is going to be released at the end of this month. So yes, you can contact me if you want a signed copy. Okay, so I think I just want to start by explaining why. Why did I go down this path about witches? Because I get that question obviously quite a lot. And it actually relates to a story that I personally experienced about 12 years ago now. As I was saying, I am a school teacher, and I was working in a school in Yorkshire in England. It was a boarding school, and it was a staunch Catholic boarding school, and that's going to be quite important for this story. And I was teaching the Odyssey. So if you know, the Odyssey is the Homeric epic, and it has Circe in it. And I was teaching it to a class, and we got to the point where Circe appears in book 10 of Homer's Odyssey. And she lures the men into her palace with her singing voice. She wines and dines them, and then she drugs their drink. And then she walks around the table where they're all sat, and she kind of taps them on their shoulders with her wand, and she transforms them into pigs. And one of the students said to me, "Oh, she sounds like a witch." And I said, "Well, yes, here we have the origins of what we call witchcraft, the kind of idea of drugging, sort of using herbs in a drink and sort of using a wand and transformative powers, etc." And then another student said, but they didn't exist until the Middle Ages. So then we got into this discussion. Well, actually, no, the witch originates far older than the Middle Ages. So we started talking about how witches kind of originated really in the classical literature, which I'll get into a little bit more. And then, of course, we have the stock character developing of the hag witch, which is still very much, dominant in our world today. And then the next day, after we had this discussion with the students, I was called into the head's office, the head teacher. And when I walked in, I thought, this is never a good sign. It's never a good sign when the head teacher wants to talk to you. You've done something wrong somewhere. And I was told that I was teaching witchcraft to the students. And I was like, well, no, wasn't teaching witchcraft. I was explaining the history of witches and giving them some context about Circe and where she might have come from. Anyway, the head teacher was very upset with me, and she actually suspended me from the school. So I had to leave the premises. It all got sorted out in the end, and I was, went back, but I didn't stay long working at the school after that moment. But what it made me realize was just how awful we have of this perception of the witch, even in the 21st century. So, albeit this happened 12 years ago, and we might have moved on perhaps somewhat since then, but I don't think we have, unfortunately. We still have this perception of the witch, and whenever the witch is mentioned or witchcraft is mentioned, of it being a very negative entity. Something terrible is going to happen if you dare to mention it. And I must stress that it was a staunch Catholic school, and maybe she found it a conflict of interest for me to talk about something like that when it's a very heavily religious environment. But it got me fascinated into, why do we feel this? Why do we still feel so negative against witches? And that's where it all started for me, really. And I started delving more and more into the classical literature that I was already teaching, but it took me off into other branches, really. I started looking at law court speeches where they were talking about women sort of being accused of poisoning, which again is obviously related to witchcraft. I discovered, which I hadn't known before, even at university, that apparently even in Augustus's time, they were burning women at the stake, even then, for being witches. And then I then sort of realized that the idea of the hag witch that we are so familiar with today, and that has become so associated with witches, really develops from the Roman period onwards. And that is essentially what my book sort of explores. It explores predominantly the evolutionary development of the hag witch, where she came from, i.e., from the classical world, and how and why she's still very much an entity in our modern era. So I'm actually going to just show you some images actually that will help me explain this a little bit more as to what I do and where I go with this. Some of these images are in the book. So if you do get the book, you'll notice that in the middle, for example, there are images there that you can sort of, have a look at as you're kind of reading it. So I've taken some of the images from the book, but there are some new images that I've added for the purposes of our talk today. So I'll
Can I
just
ask a
put
quick
this up.
question?
Yes.
How old were those kids in your class?
So this would have been in the UK, this would be like a year 10 class. So they would have been about 15 years old. Um, and I suppose if you think about it, then those teenagers, they have been, for me, going back to that moment, I suddenly thought, well, they've been raised to believe that witches are more medieval. They haven't had that idea or that concept of where witches sort of come from, which is more ancient than that. But yeah, it's an interesting question. That actually, you would think they were maybe younger and therefore weren't so familiar with the idea of witches.
Well, I just found their questions were insightful and their
Mm,
curiosity is really fascinating because they were kind of then told they're not allowed to ask those kind of questions. So
yes.
I'm going to let you go on with your slides, but I just had to ask.
Yes, yeah, and that's a very interesting point. They were from that moment told that that's it. Yeah, closed argument. You're not going to find out anything more about it. Yes, exactly. Yes, I'm going to put the slides up for you all. So I'm going to start with this one. Hopefully, you can all see this. So here I've got three images. Two of them you'll readily find in the book if you do. Purchase it and buy it. So what you've got here on the left, you've got Hecate in her sort of three-formed imagery, which is the most recognizable imagery of Hecate, the goddess Hecate of witchcraft from Greek mythology, Greek history. On the right-hand side, there is Circe. She's pouring poison here into a pool, and this is Waterhouse's imagery of her that was sort of produced in the late 1800s. In the middle, though, I'm actually going to start with this one. This is a very, very ancient figurine. This is from Catalhayek. This kind of dates from around 6000 BC. and it shows a mother goddess figurine. She's known as the mistress of animals. She's seated with felines either side of her, and she's obviously, a voluptuous woman here. And I talk about this in the book actually because I trace the origins of the witch, and by doing so, I do go back to prehistory, which is what we've got here, and I argue that the idea of the witch comes from these mother goddess figurines that are found in places like Catalhayek or across Europe, actually. They're collectively known as Venus figurines, and they were typically shown as being voluptuous because they were related to fertility. And their collective term is the mistress of the animals because they were often associated with felines. As you can see here, she's got some lionesses either side of her. And it's actually from this imagery that we have the likes of the sort of goddesses that hopefully you're probably all familiar with from Greek myth, the goddesses like Circe, for example, the likes of Medea, or indeed Hecate that you've got over here. Circe especially has a very close relationship to this imagery of the Catalhayek woman here, because she too is associated with felines in Homer's Odyssey. She is also associated with being like a life giver because she helps Odysseus with his journey and therefore helps him sort of survive and therefore is a life giver. She also is associated with the underworld as well, as was the sort of seated woman here in the Catalhayek imagery. She was discovered with sort of raptorial images around her, and the image of the raptor, the bird of prey, is often associated with death too. So she has that kind of connection between life and death, just as Circe does too, because she's connected to the underworld. She actually helps Odysseus sort of take part in his journey to the underworld, for instance. And as I was saying, she's also this kind of idea of the life giver. So there is this kind of idea that Circe, who we do sort of class as the first witch that we have in Western literature, she is derived from a much older imagery of an older goddess, perhaps something like the Catalhayek imagery that you have here, and then she gets morphed into this divine imagery that we have in the Homeric Odyssey. So in other words, what I'm saying here is that these women start out as good. They start out as life givers, and they start out as those that will help you in getting into the underworld. There's nothing sinister about the Catalhayek imagery, and certainly there's nothing sinister about the imagery we have of her in Homer's Odyssey, albeit she does obviously change Odysseus' men into pigs, but she becomes a benefactor after that moment. She's not evil per se. And obviously linked to this is Hecate as well, because Hecate also is a goddess that is very much good to begin with. She is recognizable with her triple form. She was a guardian of the crossroads. So often you would see her actually at crossroads within the sort of ancient Greek society, with her head sort of looking out beyond to the roads where people might be starting journeys. But she's also associated with the underworld as well. She was almost like a psychopomp of sorts, which was an entity that guided you, to the underworld. So she has that connection to the underworld, just as Circe does too. And she starts out as a good, divine, boundary goddess. So all of these imageries that we have here in the middle, Hecate, the Catalhayek woman, and obviously the Circe figure here, all start out as being benefactors, really good women that have a little bit of magic thrown in here and there. They have their kind of transformative powers, but they're beneficial. But then they get maligned. And we kind of see this around the 5th century BC. And I think the reasoning behind this is because in the 5th century BC, we have this kind of move to more patriarchy, particularly in the ancient Greek world. If you look at Athens, for example, it becomes a heavily patriarchal society. And that's when we begin to see more malignant imagery of these goddesses. For instance, Hecate gets called upon by Medea in Euripides' Medea, particularly at the moment when Medea's planning her sort of killing of her own sons, her own filicide, and she calls upon Hecate to aid her in that moment of this terrible death that she's going to bring to her own children. And it's really from that moment that we begin to see Hecate changing into more of a consort for women like Medea. She becomes more witch-like in her powers. She becomes more associated with restless ghosts and spirits as well, those ghosts that cannot settle in the afterlife and want to haunt others. And likewise, Circe also falls prey to this demonization. With the rise of the patriarchy in the 5th century BC, we begin to see Circe, unfortunately, also becoming more of a femme fatale figure. And that's how Circe, unfortunately, lasts really throughout centuries. She becomes increasingly more malignant, increasingly more lustful, a woman that lures you for sexual purposes, but then she'll then sort of use her powers to transform you into something quite wild and hideous. In fact, this imagery that we have of her here, this is the very famous Waterhouse imagery of her that was produced at the late 1800s. It shows the moment that she's pouring poison into a pool that Scylla, the nymph, who she is jealous of, is going to immerse herself in. And from that poison, Scylla's going to get transformed into the hideous, monstrous sea monster that is used, actually, that is referred to in Homer's Odyssey, the creature that will eat sort of sailors passing by and gobble them up. Um, so, so Circe unfortunately falls prey to this imagery of being quite malignant. And I think you can probably see from the imagery here, she does look full on evil content there. And certainly the green hues of the painting kind of bring out the evilness of this woman. But thankfully, when we kind of get into the 20th century and now obviously the 21st century, Hecate and Circe especially get redeemed. So with the rise of the feminist movements that we have during the 20th century, so you're looking at sort of the suffragette movement leading into the kind of feminist movement of the 1960s, and on the back of the 1960s feminist movement, we have writers like Margaret Atwood, who's very, very famous. I'm pretty sure all of you know Margaret Atwood. She decided to give a feminist voice to the likes of Circe. She actually wrote a poem in her honor, and she wrote about Circe's feelings about being targeted by Odysseus and his men. So she is the first to actually give a voice to these sort of somewhat downtrodden women throughout history. And then, of course, in the 21st century, we have the very famous Madeline Miller, who does the same for Circe in her very famous rendition of her Circe, which I know is an incredibly popular book worldwide. And Hecate too she gets redeemed too. She's somewhat associated with neo-paganism, which was on its rise in the 20th century. And of course, we have the rise of the Wiccan religion as well. They have their own triple goddess, which is somewhat equated to the Hecate imagery. So these goddesses get redeemed. They get all those beneficial qualities that they kind of lost with the kind of rise of patriarchy in the 5th century BC, and they get restored, if you like, to what they originally were. However, there is one witch that doesn't get that sense of restoration, and that is the Hag Witch. So the Hag Witch is an entity that still lives on in our world. She is still very much present in pop culture. You will see her in the fantasy miniseries. You'll see her in the world of the horror movie. You'll see her in the sword and sorcery sort of films that you have in the 1980s and in the 1990s. And you'll see her in more recent programs. For example, she makes an appearance in Game of Thrones and more recently in Netflix, The Witcher. So the Hag Witch has held on. And the Hag Witch was an entity that was very much developed by the Romans. Anyone that knows about Roman society will know that they were just like the Athenians, insofar as they were very heavily patriarchal society. Their society was built upon fathers and sons, a heavy patriarchy, and women do not come off well in the literature during the Roman period. They have very little voices, for one thing, and if they do have a voice, they are often maligned. They are evil figures. They are essentially witches. They are hag witches. And we really begin to see the development of this around the late Roman Republican era into the rise of the imperial regime under the first Roman Emperor Augustus. Augustus, especially, he was obviously being the first Roman emperor. He wanted to instill a sense of morality within the Romans because he believed that Roman women, especially, had become quite licentious during the late Roman Republic. He could see women sort of committing more adulterous affairs. They were readily sort of divorcing and marrying other men. And he said, we have to put a stop to this. So he decides to bring in these very heavy morality laws, where he said that every man and woman needs to be married, and that was the law. And not only do they need to be married, but they have to produce a certain amount of children as well. In fact, he rewarded families that had at least 3 children and more. So he gave them the incentive in order to make sure you develop this kind of idea of the nuclear family. So, with the backdrop of all of this, Augustus also had literature that he used as propaganda purposes in order to highlight what Roman society should be like. It should be a Stoic society, a society that was built upon morality. And by doing this, he encouraged writers to sort of produce a stock character that was going to be so hideous and so vile that it would encourage men not only to make sure that their women are kept firmly in their place, and that they don't commit any sense of immorality. It was to frighten them. So we have the development of the hag witch. This was such a vile, hideous woman that it would frighten any men not to allow a woman to have power over them and not to break their marriage, and to ensure that they remain the ever faithful woman they are meant to be. And here we have some images on the screen that display this idea of the hag witch and where it comes from. So firstly, I'm going to go to this one. This is Erictho, a very, very famous hag witch stock character that is seen by the Roman writer Lucan. He produced an epic poem called The Civil War. He was writing this under Nero, but this whole idea of the hag witch and developing a female figure that is so frightening, not only in appearance but in description, a way of making sure that women do not act in this inversive state. Lucan develops this idea further when he's writing under Nero, and he develops Erictho. And Erictho is utterly vile. She is a product of a proto-horror imagery, and certainly the likes of what you see nowadays in the horror film, in the fantasy miniseries I was mentioning earlier. And in this particular poem, she is approached by Pompey's son, Sextus Pompeius, because he wants to know the outcome of the war that his father Pompey is fighting with Julius Caesar. And that's essentially what the epic's about. It's based upon the civil war between Pompey and Julius Caesar that happened during the Republican era. And the only way that he can get a good, firm prophecy about what this outcome of the war is going to be like is approaching this witch. And she was a famous witch living in Thessaly. She lived in a dark cave, and she was known to be utterly vile. But he said, I've got to approach her because I need to know the outcome of this, and she's the only one that can prophesize it. So book 6 of Lucan's Civil War is taken up with a very, very, very thorough and intense description of this witch Erictho. And she performs necromancy. So she grabs hold of a dead body that has been strewn across the battlefield, and she reanimates the corpse. She brings the corpse back to life so that the corpse can foretell the future to Sextus Pompeius. And the necromantic scene that we have written by Lucan is just utterly vile. She uses menstrual blood, she uses parts of animals, she uses guts, anything sort of unsavory you can think about is thrown at this corpse in order to reanimate it. And because the corpse isn't sort of reacting to all the kind of things she's thrown at it, she decides to grab hold of live vipers and start whipping the corpse, at which point the corpse sort of opens its eyes, rises up, and then sort of gives the prophecy that Sextus Pompeius has been longing for. And unfortunately, the prophecy is a pretty bad one, because the corpse says to him, well, unfortunately, your father's going to die, the war's going to be a bit of a mess, and your bloodline's not going to survive. So it's not really the prophecy he had desired after all. But this imagery here that you have on the screen is actually an artist's interpretation of the Erictho. This was made by Mortimer in the sort of 17th century. And you can see here he has he's completely actually read the text here and really captured what Erictho would have looked like. She's grabbing here the live vipers in her hand, and she looks haggish, and that's the point. She is the haggish witch that we are so familiar with, and you can see it in the Roman text, and you can see it in this imagery of what he has taken from the Roman text here. She is the inversion of the woman of what we would expect of her, and that essentially is what the hag witch is. She is the inversion of the woman. She's elderly, she's haggard. Her the idea of the breasts as well is quite significant, because the breasts were meant to sag as well in the kind of hag witch imagery. They don't have the fullness of what you would expect of the female. Therefore, she's not like a life giver of what you would expect of a female with breastfeeding, etc. He's done a wonderful job here of actually capturing the imagery of her. The next one that I've given you here, this is another very famous hag witch imagery by Albrecht Dürer. And he actually did this in the early 1500s. Again, for me, it perfectly encapsulates of everything we would expect of the hag witch that stems from the Roman literature. You can see she is the inversion of the female. So her whole body is very muscular. You know, she looks quite manly, doesn't she? Very masculine. She's therefore the opposite of what you would expect of a female. Her breasts, again, are not the fullness of what you would expect of the female imagery. She has the dishevelled hair. In the top left-hand corner of the imagery, we have the sort of coming of a storm, a tempest, which again is something so typically associated with these women. These hag witches can disrupt nature. They disrupt the natural order through creating storms, as well as obviously, in the imagery of Erictho, bringing back the dead, which again is against the natural order. And that essentially is actually our definition of the witch, isn't it? When we are asked to define a witch, we typically would sort of say it's a female who does disrupt the natural order. Lots of people will probably say, well, we get that in Macbeth, don't we? You know, we definitely have it in that time period. But as I've been explaining here, actually, it's a much older interpretation. It obviously stems from the classical literature that I've been mentioning. And actually, if you delve more into the classical literature, and I do encourage all of you, if you're really interested in reading the likes of Lucan, or indeed Horace is another one. Horace has his Canidia, for example, another very hideous witch in his poems. Or you've got Ovid's Dipsas, which is another witch that doesn't really come off very well as well. She's pretty horrific. Do read them. Do go back to the classical pieces of literature and really delve into their imagery, because there you have the Shakespearean sort of weird sisters that he drew upon for his Macbeth. It's all there in the classical literature. All of it has influenced the likes of Shakespeare, or indeed the artist's imagery here done by Albrecht Dürer and Mortimer. So the hag witch doesn't get redeemed. They do not, as in the case of Hecate and Circe, have any beneficial qualities leveled at them whatsoever. They very much live on in the world that we live in today. And going back to my story at the beginning, when I was, explaining how when I mentioned the witch and witchcraft to those teenagers, and obviously it got to the head teacher. For her, the idea of the witch was this is what she was thinking of. She was thinking of all of the negative sort of disruption of natural order that unfortunately we tend to relate to witchcraft. She wasn't thinking, of course, of the likes of Circe or Hecate, or indeed the rise of the Wiccan religion, which has given a whole different voice to what witchcraft, is and certainly should be. She was thinking of how we in the modern world have been so preconditioned to view the witch as something that is actually quite horrific. And the last images I wanted to show you was some of the more modern interpretations then. So, as I was saying, the hag witch still lives with us in the modern world, and she will always do so because she lent herself, unfortunately, to this world of the horror genre, to the world of the fantasy genre. And here I've given you some images of that modern interpretation. So we do actually have a couple here from Game of Thrones. So if you're familiar with your Game of Thrones, you might be able to recognize the couple of characters I've drawn upon here. The top left-hand corner, for example, is the Red Woman. If you know your Game of Thrones, this appears at the beginning of series 6. She has a necklace around her neck, and when she takes the necklace off, she turns into the Hag Witch. So the necklace sort of makes her look beautiful and not haggish. When she takes that necklace off, she becomes the haggish woman. And as you know, the Red Woman is not a very nice woman in Game of Thrones. She, if you remember the scene with the little girl that she encourages to be burnt at the stake, for example, she's a pretty maligned character in that series. In the top right hand corner, this is also from Game of Thrones as well. There's a scene at the beginning of series 5. Circe has a flashback episode when she's a child, and she's wandering through the woods, and she wants to get a prophecy from a witch that she knows lives in the woods, and she goes and visits the witch. Now, she's obviously not as haggish as you would expect. However, she's pretty horrific in the imagery that surrounds her. She lives in this old hut, and it's got sort of dead animals hanging up inside of it. And she's in the middle of a forest, as you would expect of witches to live in that kind of liminal environment. Circe enters and she asks for the prophecy, and the witch provides it to her, and she sort of prophesies the deaths of her children, for example. And then she starts cackling, that typical sort of, again, that sound that we normally associate with witches is provided to her. But again, you can see the kind of idea of where these women come from. It's all going way back to how they are portrayed in the likes of the Roman literature. And then other imagery that you've got here, I've given you Conan the Barbarian, that kind of film from the early 80s that actually has a vampiric witch in it. She's a bit sort of Circean in style, in the sense that she's beautiful. She lures Conan into her hut, she wines and dines him, and then she becomes doesn't transform him as Circe does, but she becomes a vampire and she tries to suck his blood. So again, this is very much drawing upon the Roman literature again, because Ovid, for example, talks about the Strigae, who are the vampiric witches from the Roman world. He believed, there was a belief in the Roman times that women could morph into a screech owl, and then they would, in the middle of the night, they would go to house to house to house to suck on the blood of infants. So the whole idea of the vampiric witch does derive from there. And then I've given you an imagery here from the Evil Dead series. So if you're familiar with those films, the third installment has a witch in it, which is the top middle imagery there. I've given you the 3 witches from the Beastmaster. Whoever wrote the Beastmaster was definitely drawing upon Shakespearean imagery there. But the idea of the 3 witches does derived from the classical world too, because we have the Grey sisters, for example, and we have the three fates too. But he does them quite hideous, as you can see there. They are haggish, they are evil within that film. And then the last two, you've got Hansel and Gretel, actually. This is a more recent film from about 2013. They did a horror version of it where the Hansel and Gretel, it's a reimagining, actually. They are witch hunters in the film, and they go and seek evil witches that they kill. And there's one of them there in the bottom sort of middle imagery there. And then one of my favorites actually is from the fairy tale theatre from the early 80s. This was actually an American production, and I was able to watch it as when I was growing up. Actually, I loved it. This is from the Hansel and Gretel. Everyone knows the Hansel and Gretel story, so you know it's the woman who lives in the middle of the woods. Her house is made out of candy. She lures children to the house through the candy. She then entraps them, fattens them up, and she wants to sort of eat them. Again, this idea of cannibalism is very much something you'll see in the Roman literature too, if you do delve into it. That actually was Joan Collins there as the witch. She also played the stepmother in that version as well. So as you can see, the idea of the sort of haggish evil witch lives on in our world. You've got images there from the last sort of 40 years or so of pop culture, and she will always live on. And we can definitely thank the classical literature and most definitely the Romans for this concept. I will stop share there.
Wow. Okay. Thank you so much for that. I have a couple of comments in the chat that I wanted to comment on. Say is Meryl Streep's Witch in the Into the Woods, a good one. Tim Burton's Sleepy Hollow, which is really scary. I've opened up the chat to everybody so you can chat with each other again. But I wanted to ask you, I'm crowdsourcing. What is your impression? What witches in pop culture or history or art are you aware of? And we might be able to chat about it a little bit. But I did want to ask you, the first question that came up, Alexis, is about the differing perspective of witches that has happened in the last 40 years, such as in Harry Potter or Bewitched or Charmed, as we talked about before. Was it always bad before that? And then what made people start looking at the possibility of them being good?
So I think definitely the rise of the Wiccan religion has a lot to answer for this, and definitely has helped more positive imagery of witches. So if you look at sort of TV series like Charmed, you've got those, the three girls kind of working together to get rid of sort of evil entities, haven't they, from our world? So definitely Wiccan religion has an impact upon that. So we see the rise of Wiccan religion around the sort of 1940s, 1950s, and coinciding with that is this idea of neo-paganism as well, where they are trying to promote the idea of white witchcraft and the white witch imagery. And as a result of that, that has, and also combined with the kind of feminist movement that we have in the 1960s as well, has encouraged us to see witches in a much more positive light. So yes, definitely what the comments you were mentioning there, we do have images of more positive females, certainly from I would say the 1990s onwards for sure. When I was growing up in the 1990s, Wicca was a huge thing, and you could buy books on it. The idea of crystals and using crystal balls was very, very positively looked upon. So definitely that has helped sort of divide the line between the sort of haggish evil and the more good white imagery. And actually, going back to that film that was mentioned there about Hansel and Gretel, they do that quite cleverly in that film, because they have a white witch and they also have a dark evil sort of grand witch, if you like. And the white witch obviously is given fair share, characterization. She's a very good, kind witch. So they do try to show that there are differing sort of aspects of witchcraft in the world that we live in. I suppose my point is really with the hag witch, I don't think we're ever going to shake it off. We're always going to have that very dark, malignant imagery. She's always going to be there. And I think it's not just the fact that, oh, there's still misogyny in the world and therefore that imagery is still going to survive. I think it's because we as humans like horror. We like our characters to be quite horrific at times. And therefore, I think that's why she'll always be there.
Mhm.
Irregardless of the fact that we might have things like Wicked now, for example, that has given a good voice to Elphaba and the Wicked Witch of the West. But I think she's there because we enjoy our horror films. We're drawn to them. We like them, and we like the stock characters that we get in them. So I think that's part of it too,
Absolutely.
psychologically.
So I did have heard from that Samantha from Bewitched and Glenda and the Wicked Witch of the West from Wizard of Oz. But I have a question about that too, and we do have a bunch of questions that I'm going to get to. Um, is that one of my favorite movies of all times is called Megamind, and it's basically about that people can be heroic and people can be evil depending on how they are raised. This has come up in Wicked as well. So, is there a place for that as well in the lore around the fact that a witch might not have been born evil, but becomes evil because of the way they were treated?
Yeah, and do you mean like in the classical literature at all, if we have
Yeah.
that kind of idea?
Hmm.
Uh, yes, I mean we do have, for example, there's a woman called Samatha, written by Theocrates. She was Hellenistic more than Roman actually, and she was just an ordinary girl, and she loses the love of her life. He goes to another woman, and she's terribly, obviously, upset by that. So she decides to seek out a witch that will help her get her love back. And she gets heavily into the witchcraft element of it. She gets drawn into it and how you can use spells and curses and herbs in order to bring back someone you love. So she grows more and more obsessed with the idea of witchcraft as a result of that. So yeah, absolutely. There are still in the lore of sort of Roman folklore this idea that a woman can be drawn into it who hasn't necessarily been born to it.
Hmm.
So yes, and actually the Roman literature does that quite a lot with witches. They are predominantly mortal with ordinary lives, and they turn towards it at a later time. So yes, it's not necessarily something you're born with. It's something that by nurture you can be drawn towards by external forces. So
Hmm.
yeah, that does come about in the literature, in the classical literature as well.
Okay. Somebody asked, how do you spell the name of the castle associated with the ancient fertility figure?
What? Sorry. Then
The one that was in the middle in black and white. Was there a castle?
is there a castle? Was there? I don't think there was. Shall I go back to it?
Was it in a castle? Was it an art piece in a castle? Oh,
Oh,
cattle.
Cattle Hayek.
Oh,
Oh, sorry. Yeah, sorry. I wondered what
okay.
you were asking me there. Yeah, Cattle Hayek. Yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, Cattle Hayek is the place where that figurine was actually found. It's in the book actually. I mentioned Cattle Hayek and also that the imagery of the seated goddess I talk about quite a bit there.
Thank you, Sarah. Okay, so Roger asks, is there any reason why Hecate and Circe are shown as being so extraordinarily tall and slender in those early art pieces?
So the one of Circe that I showed you was done by Waterhouse. So that was much later imagery of her.
Mhm.
We don't actually have an awful lot of imagery of her from the classical world. We have some vase paintings that depict her, but typically, because in the sort of Greek and Roman perspective, divine imagery is generally tall and slender for females. The imagery of the Cat Hayek figure is more primordial, prehistory, and they tend to be portrayed much more voluptuous and were typically because of their kind of fertility connections and this idea
Mhm.
of life giving. So there is that transition actually when you get to the more sort of classical art where women become, and also men become more muscular, women become more slender. So yeah, there is that kind of transition between how anatomy is viewed between those time periods. I've often been quite fascinated with that myself, given that this idea of the woman being sort of seen as as perfect as being thin and slender really again actually you could go delve into this does come from the classical world perception.
Interesting.
Absolutely.
I guess they didn't have Ozempic back then or whatever. Rob asks, what about the Witch of Endor as prototype
Yeah,
for
oh,
of Hagwitch? She would have a great impact on Western world, yes?
yes. Oh, Witch of Endor. I talk about Witch of Endor. So I have a whole appendix on her as well. I had to talk about the Witch of Endor. So yeah, the Witch of Endor. Now I talk about the dating of this because this was going to be quite important for what I was arguing here. I obviously arguing that the idea of the hag witch imagery is a classical concept. The Witch of Endor is never portrayed as haggish in the Bible. I must stress that. That's one thing to be aware of. The story of the Witch of Endor sort of derives around the sort of 8 to 600 BC. So it comes after the whole idea of the Homeric composition of the epics, which we date up to around 900. So this is my theory. Obviously, it's a theory, but my theory is that the idea of Circe, the idea of prophecy of what obviously the Witch of Endor is all about, derives from Circe. It influences the story of the Witch of Endor, which I delve into this. I kind of do research on this. Was first written down in its written form around 600 BC. But yeah, the Witch of Endor is an important one. She is very similar, actually, in what she does to Erictho. She lives in a cave. She lives on the liminal part of society. She is a prophetess. She is approached to give a prophecy for a war. But that's all we get. We don't get any physical description of her in the biblical text in the Old Testament. We don't know what she looks like. We don't even know what the necromantic scene was like either. Nothing of detail is provided there whatsoever. In fact, we get more detail of the necromantic scene by Circe that Odysseus has to perform in order to get to the underworld than we do with the Witch of Endor. So my belief is that the classical world is the influencer than the Witch of Endor story.
Mary asks, is there a specific difference between a witch and a hag witch?
uh, so the hag witch is still part of the same family. Do you mean that in the sense that you get kind of white witches versus the more hag witches, which is more evil? I guess is the kind of
No,
got.
she asked this question very early on before you started your slides. So I think we didn't know that there were two different ways of describing a witch.
Yeah, I mean, okay, so I suppose the generic description of a witch is this idea of a female that can subvert the natural order. She can disrupt the natural order. That is the general definition. And if you look at even words like, for example, the early sort of English word for witch, which is like Wicca or Wicklen, it is kind of connected to this idea of bewitching and cursing. And that's the derivative really of it. So the witch generically is someone that causes harm, essentially. So there is no differentiation really between witch and the hag witch. They were kind of one and the same. They caused harm. They disrupted natural order.
Mhm.
It's only really, to be fair, in our modern world where we've kind of sort of said, we've got white witch, we've got bad witches, and the bad witch tends to be, the kind of ugly one, if you like. But I suppose in the Roman world, in the Greek world, they had many, many different terms for their witches. So they would have had that the pharmakides in the Greek world were the ones that dealt specifically with herbs. In the Roman world, you had the saga, who was the prophetess, or more generic word for witch generally, but they were generally the ones that would perform prophecies. The Greek and Roman world have quite a variety of vocabulary actually to differentiate between the different powers that these witches actually have. It's in the book though. If you want to read, it's in the book.
Kind of sounds like the Power Rangers, but that was me. Was Joan of Arc considered a witch?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't actually delve into it, but I suppose this idea that the burning of the stake of her, yes, she probably would have had some sort of ideas pertaining to that. I didn't do any research on her. That would be an interesting one to delve more into. Yeah, definitely.
Okay. I just have a couple comments here. Kim says, I was visited by a hag witch a few years ago. It was not in an evil or dark way. And JM says, even Claire in Outlander is considered a witch when she uses medicine to heal people when they had an unclear or uneducated understanding of health issues. Absolutely. When people don't understand things, they often look to the supernatural.
They do, yes, absolutely. And yeah, I mean, with the idea of the hag witch, obviously, I'm not sort of saying hag witches are bad and evil. That's not what I'm saying. It's just how they're perceived to be within the pop culture we have today. Unfortunately, we still sort of associate those negative sort of characteristics with the idea of the title hag witch, and that's why, from the images I showed you, you'll still predominantly still get that in movies that we have, and fantasy books, etc.
Mhm.
But yeah, that what that comment was saying there about how a woman, there was this idea of women using medicine, women using herbs. They're automatically labeled in a very negative sense. And actually, again, if you delve into the classical literature, we see that as early as Homer, actually, because we have a scene with Helen, where she invites Telemachus, Odysseus' son, into her island, and she can see that he's tired. So she says, "Look, let me give you a concoction that I can mix with herbs." And the way that it's described in the text, you automatically can't help but see Helen in a very negative, malignant light there. He's almost sort of relating her to witchcraft in that moment. So it's this idea of women cooking, mixing herbs. They automatically get just associated with witchcraft in a very negative sense.
Mm, yeah. Um, it's unfortunate because it was always, was it always women? I mean, were there men also accused of witchcraft, if they were herbalists or whatever?
Yes, yeah, we do have in the sources men, certainly, like we do in the medieval period. We know that men were also targeted alongside women, but the sources show, as it does from the medieval times as well, and the Jacobean period, that women were more likely to have this accusation than the men. So it definitely was a more female concept. And actually, if you look at the Roman world, all of the kind of titles that they use for the different sort of powers that these women have, they're all in their feminine form in the Latin language, which implies therefore the belief became more strongly associated with women than with men.
Mm-hmm. Because, as Huck points out, there were men that were accused of witchcraft in Salem, although
Mm.
obviously way, way less than
Way
women.
less, yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Um, Sarah asks really quick, could you show us the frieze on the bookshelf behind you? Because you showed me the witches earlier and it's adorable. Lovely.
There they are.
I love it. Okay. So that was I want to delve into in the last few minutes. I have a couple more questions. About the witches in Salem, because we had been talking about this before we started, is that there were a lot of issues around why people were called witches or
Mhm.
accused of being witches. Can you delve into that a little bit? And does that come from Roman times, or is that specifically like the witch trials of the U.S. and the and Europe?
Yeah, so with the European sort of witch craze, witch hunts, and obviously with the Salem witch trials, as we were talking about actually before this started, there's lots of historical reasons at that time as to why that might have come about. So the socio-economic sort of reasons. I mean, it was a very hard existence back then. People were very poor. You might accuse someone of witchcraft perhaps for money, for example. It might help your situation. Um, there's a lot of factors associated with that. If you go back to the Roman world and as to why women were increasingly sort of accused of witchcraft, I suppose some of the reasons that you have there, which I'll explain in a second, might be somewhat some of the reasons you might have had during the sort of 16th century to the 17th century. So in the Roman times, we know, especially during the early imperial regime, so we're talking here about the kind of Augustan period, women increasingly were accused of witchcraft more and more and more. And the reason actually was more to do with the upper classes. So within the imperial household, we have the likes of Livia, for example, who was the wife of Augustus, a very powerful woman. She comes off as a very powerful matriarch, actually, in the literature, if you delve into it. She was constantly using witchcraft as a way of getting rid of her rivals. So
Hmm.
she would say, "Oh, so and so was about to put some herbs in, mixing herbs over there. I think she's a witch. and she would have her carted off. So
Mhm.
any kind of potential rival that was going to sort of be seen to take over her power, she would go down the route of saying, oh, witchcraft, witchcraft, witchcraft. And this was adopted by a lot of other imperial women at the time, and it kind of spread throughout the rest of that, particularly throughout that Julio-Claudian period in the sort of 1st century sort of BC. So that's one of the reasons why witchcraft was quite very much on the rise during that time. It was a way of removing potential rivals within the imperial household. It was a very easy method to eradicate them. Another reason as well, if you were an upper class woman, you had a lot of reputation tied up with yourself as a female. And in that kind of circumstance, in that situation, if you saw, for example, your husband sort of playing around with the slave girl, you had to remove that slave girl to maintain the kind of reputation you were trying to exert publicly. So again, they would use witchcraft to remove the girl from the premises. So we have a lot of evidence that suggests that's what was going on during that imperial time. And as a result of that, though, the hag witch was used to really stop all this meddling of these women, stop this going on, put women in their place, make them be moral, stop them having affairs, stop them sort of using their power to accuse others and, create this imagery to sort of frighten men into action, basically. So that's what we have going on during the imperial times. And I should imagine that even in the sort of times of the Salem witch trials or the European witch hunt craze, that there was probably something like that going on. I read a book recently, actually, that was about a more upper class family that were accusing people of witchcraft, and it might be through reputation purposes. So yeah, definitely same sort of reasons going on there, perhaps. But yeah, I mean, certainly we have to sort of think about the socioeconomic reasons at the time too, particularly with the witches that were accused, because they were generally of the lower class in the witch hunts.
Alexis, do you have a couple of extra minutes to stay just to get through the questions? Because
Yes.
I want to dig into that a little bit because I what you just said is like opposite of what I believed, that people with power were using it to get rid of people or witches. I always thought it was people that were powerless were using it to gain power over other people.
Oh, do you mean in a classical world perspective, or
Yeah,
just
just in general.
so not in the sources we don't necessarily have that idea actually happening in the classical world. So not necessarily trying to sort of gain power over others in that respect. It was actually the more evidence we have is more relatable to the upper classes using it for the purposes of removing rivals. So yeah, it's a slightly different perspective going on there than what we perhaps have in the sort of 1700s.
Okay, so a couple comments. Rob says Giles Corey was pressed to death as a warlock in Salem. Our audience obviously knows their Salem lore very
Yes,
well.
there's lots of Salem questions.
And Huck says that dogs were also accused of being witches in Salem. Wow. And this is the last question I'm going to ask because it's a really good one. And I think it's very, I would be curious about it as well. As Mary asks, are there witches in other cultures besides the Greco-Roman? How about Incan, Native American, Bantu, any of that?
They're everywhere. Yes. There's witches in all cultures. And in fact, if you look to the very ancient world, so I'm going here sort of to the Egyptians, to the sort of Mesopotamian sort of period. And indeed, even if you go to sort of prehistory, you would have found a figure that would have been relatable to witches, but they wouldn't have had a word that they would have associated with her being a witch. We have that more in the Greek and Roman world where they were kind of labeling these women according to power, but obviously they are witches per se. But yeah, I mean, if you look at Mesopotamia, for example, you've got Ishtar, that goddess in the Mesopotamian mythology. Oh my goodness me. I mean, she is a demoness,
Mm.
essentially. She has transformative powers. She exerts power over others through herbs, through curses and spells. So definitely, yes, you'll get them in all other cultures, not just the Greco-Roman world. For me, though, the Greco-Roman world sets it in stone. That's where we really see the imagery of what we're so familiar with, and indeed, is so relatable to other cultures as well, and definitely influenced. If you think about the Roman world just for a second and how vast that was, I mean, it covered the whole of Europe. It went into the Middle East. And certainly those stories would have spread far beyond that. And there's no reason why that wouldn't have influenced cultures outside of that.
Hmm. Right. And for like way back, as you said, even prior to that, again, is the fear of the unknown.
Mm,
It's often a supernatural, like we think it's
mm.
supernatural, like
And it's just human nature, isn't it? It's
right.
human nature to kind of fall into that sort of idea, isn't it? Anything is different. Anything, it's kind of sense of alterity, isn't it? Anything that is the other, that is different, we don't like,
Hmm. Right.
unfortunately. And that's just human nature. At the moment, I'm kind of researching sort of monsters and monstrosity, and in the Roman world, anything that kind of lived on the edge of their society, uh, they perceived these humans to even look hideous. So
Mm.
they had big ears, or they had hair grown where hair shouldn't be grown. So it's again, it's this idea is that anything that is different, anything that's not part of what we perceived to be civilized, is going to be horrific.
Hmm. That's so true. So I know that First Witches has just come out, not even in the US yet. Are you doing something else? Are you going towards the second book?
I am, yes. I am actually writing about monsters, ancient Greek monsters.
I love it. As soon as you said it, I was like, oh, she's gonna write a book about monsters.
Yes, there you go. And maybe I'll have like a row of like cyclopes of something, the one-eyed monster on my shelf at that point.
I love it. Well, I'll be looking forward to that maybe next year or
Oh,
as
it probably won't be until 2027.
oh,
So,
okay. Well, we'll have to have you back, Alexis. This has been delightful
oh,
and
thank
so
you.
fascinating.
Thank
And
you.
and for everybody who's been listening and you all of your wonderful questions, I hope you have a wonderful day. And definitely find Alexis on social media if you want to buy her signed book. If you want to buy her regular book, you can buy it anywhere, and you can certainly find it at your local library. So thank you, Alexis. Have a wonderful evening. I know it's
Yes,
evening
it
over
is.
there.
It's 8 o'clock here.
We're terrible with time zones, apparently. But again, thank you so much for taking your time to do this.
Thank you so much for having me. I've really enjoyed it, and hope I hope you've enjoyed it too.
Oh, I absolutely have. And you can see from the emojis, everybody else here has too.
Yeah, I saw that. It's really nice. Lots of hearts.
That's right. All right. Goodbye. Goodbye, everybody.